Hi, thanks. So I'm going to talk about cellular agriculture, which is a field that's developing that we think will take the world by storm over the next couple of decades. And it basically just envisions that all products that come from animals today will eventually come from cells. So I'm going to touch on one of the biggest topics in cellular agriculture, which gets a lot of attention these days, which is cell-based meat. And so I think the best way to structure a conversation on cell-based meat is to talk about its antithesis, which is animal-based meat. And so in summary, animal-based meat comes from farming animals, and cell-based meat will come from farming cells. And the reason at CAST that we focus on this technology, and a lot of people in our space do, is because we see a lot of benefits that it will offer to people, animals, and the world. And there's a lot of sort of varied benefits to cellular agriculture beyond that. And again, specifically on cell-based meat or growing meats without animals, but from cells instead. And so a huge one under the category of people is public health, and how today, under an animal agricultural system, a ton of antibiotics go to feeding livestock because of the close quarters that they live in. And 80% of antibiotics are fed to livestock, and about half of foodborne illness comes from the meat industry. But in a cell ag system, because we don't use animals, we won't have any antibiotic use, and we can produce animal products, especially cell-based meat, in closed bioprocess environments to ensure that no pathogens break out, et cetera. Another benefit that most people sort of immediately think about when they think about not farming animal products from animals, from cells, is animal welfare. And that today we kill over 1 trillion animals for food annually around the world. That's over 30,000 animals are killed for food every second, mainly aquatic life. In a cellular agriculture system, when we take a cell from an animal and grow animal products without killing animals, we do just this. 0 animals are killed under a cell ag system. Food security is a serious problem over the next couple of decades because of rising GDPs, which is generally coupled with rising protein demand around the world. And right now, it's going to be a serious problem if we only use animal agriculture to feed or sort of supply this protein demand around the world, about 10 billion people by 2050, and again, with rising animal protein demand. But with cellular agriculture, we think it offers a viable solution to food security concerns of the future because of scaling that we'll get into in a little while. Water conservation is something that's not often thought about when it comes to animal agriculture, but a ton of water is used in animal agriculture to feed the crops, or that goes towards the crops, which ultimately feeds the livestock. That's where much of the water comes from. So about 7,000 liters of water is needed to produce just 1 pound of beef. That's on average like 10 years of drinking water for a person. That's used to produce 1 pound of beef, which is often a meal for a single person in the first world. And the cell-based meat system, early life cycle analyses and LCAs suggest we'll use about 98% less water because we don't feed any crops. The cells grow in a media, which is much less water intensive. Interplanetary travel, I thought this was sort of fitting, especially with the logo of Time Machine, that thinking about over the next couple of decades, if we have ambitions to go to colonize Mars, it's impractical to bring animals on spaceships to ultimately slaughter them or breed them, and it makes a lot more sense to bring something like a package of cells, which could feed a colony on Mars for really indefinitely, depending on what kind of science you're using within the sphere of cellular agriculture. And then there are really so many benefits. I think this is the last one I touch on, which is ocean health, and that most people don't also know that the meat industry is one of the worst ocean polluters, dumping manure and other sort of toxic chemicals into the ocean, which kills marine life, and there's a bunch of other trickle-down damages that come from that. Again, no animal, so no waste that would come from an animal. This is actually a statistic. 90,000 pounds of manure are produced annually, dumped into the ocean. If you look at the worst ocean polluters, top 10, you have multiple meat industry or meat-producing companies on that list. And with the cellular agriculture system, no manure is produced, minimal waste from a cell ag production system, and 0 tons of manure. But just a few prospects that cell ag offers. Myself and a few colleagues in the field are finishing up this sort of document. We've been working on it for a couple years. We're at like 70 reasons at this point. We'd like to get to 170 reasons to consider cell ag, but the prospective benefits vary immensely, and those are just a few of them. So let's talk about the science or sort of the process of how animal ag is done in contrast to cellular agriculture. Today, in an animal agriculture-based system, we start with breeding animals. In this case, we'll just use chickens as an example. So we raise animals. We then transport them. Generally, a slaughterhouse is not on site. So we transport those animals to a slaughterhouse where they're ultimately killed, and that's how we get a final product. For the last thousands of years, or not with the truck, but for thousands of years, we've been killing animals for animal products. With the cellular agriculture system, you start by taking a small biopsy from an animal, so a chicken, for example, and meat is made up of more than just muscle, so it's muscle, fat, connective tissue, and again, this is sort of an early process of something that would ultimately be done over the next few years. But we obtain a biopsy from the animal, you isolate the cells that you take from the chicken in this case, you put it into a bioreactor, which is like what our bodies do, which feed it nutrients, and then ultimately the cells proliferate enough and differentiate into their particular structures or cell types until you have the same sort of final product. So we're not interested in creating products that are different, like you may have heard of plant-based meats, which are made of plants. This is made of animal cells, which is the same that meat is made of. And if you look molecularly, the constituency of the product is actually the same. So that's sort of what cell ag is, what cell-based meat is, what some of the benefits are, the process. So I thought it's appropriate to go into who is leading cell-based meat. There's three kind of sectors, I'd say, that the field is broken down to today. And the first is commercial entities. So we have companies like Memphis Meats, Finless Foods is another one, led by Mike Selden. And companies like Just and Wild Type, these are just a few companies. At the end of the talk, I'll share with you our site, which basically has this talk broken down into interactive version. But these are some of the other examples of companies that work in cell-based meat. I can go through a few of them here. Super Meat works on chicken. Integra is from Japan. Mission Bard's primary focus is on fat. Wild Type is working on salmon and sort of a range of different products. And to reiterate, at CAS and our focus on cellular agriculture is beyond just food and meat, and working with companies that are working on rhino horn to reduce poaching and dairy and eggs, and I'm just focusing on meat for this talk. So that's the commercial entities in cell ag and cell-based meat. Then you have NGOs, and that's sort of where CAS falls under. Our focus is to advance cellular agriculture and cell-based meat. So you have the Good Food Institute, CAS, New Harvest, just a few examples of NGOs in the space of cell ag, and we primarily not working directly on the science, at least New Harvest and GFI do. CAS, we focus on other areas of cell ag. And then, of course, you have investment on how to fund the massive research endeavor, which is cellular agriculture. And I think this is sort of broken down, again, into a trichotomy of VCs like Starlight Ventures, Straight Out Capital, SOSV, Horizon Ventures. You have individuals like Bill Gates and Richard Branson, who have now invested in cell-based meat either last year or 2016. And then you have traditional companies that have now invested in cellular agriculture, which is very promising, like Cargill and Tyson, which are two top meat-producing companies in the world. So that's who is involved in cell ag and cell-based meat. And so you might be wondering where this is all happening. Well, cellular agriculture is happening all over the world. There's a lot of, there's certainly a focus in the US. But you have Super Meat in Israel, Most Meat in the Netherlands, multiple companies in the Netherlands, Meatables also in the Netherlands, Integra is in Japan, like I said. But again, the focus is really in the US, in the Bay Area, I'd say. 80+% of the emphasis on cell ag is in the Bay Area, maybe in a 5-mile radius in Berkeley. Cell ag dairy, cell ag eggs, meats especially, mainly in the Bay Area. And then you have the NGOs sort of lined up on the east coast of the US, CAS, GFI, and New Harvest. So that's sort of where this is all happening. So what will affect the commercialization? How will this get to the scale, sort of a global scale around the world, and implement some of those benefits that we talked about before? So I think there's a ton of variables that will affect the commercialization of cellular agriculture. One of them is, governmental structure. The FDA and USDA had multiple meetings recently over the last few months talking about how this sort of product will be regulated, and it goes beyond that. A company working on rhino horn is being held up primarily by regulation at this point. So governmental structure plays a huge role, especially in other countries, and it's very varied in how it will affect cell ag. Current industry support is really important. I think often people look at our industry and think it's sort of cell ag versus the meat industry. Well, the meat industry, if you deconstruct the meat industry, you have sort of factory farm workers and slaughterhouse workers who would technically sort of not be labored if this was the status quo system. But the corporations themselves would just sell a different sort of product, and so which is why Cargill and Tyson are on board. Then you have antibiotic producers, which would not be producing antibiotics to the same scale to feed animals. corn and soy producers that feed a ton of corn and soy to animals today. No animals, not as much grain to be fed to the animals. And there's a lot of nuance there, right? Whatever the media is made out of, the cells have to consume something as well. So that will be another industry there. But the current industry support is very important because they have the market and they've had it for forever, essentially. Nation development is critically important. Where we will see cell ag is probably in the first world, in the US, Israel, certain areas around the world that have more economic development. And when they will trickle down to developing nations, I think will take a while, similar to what we're seeing, I think, right now in plant-based meat with higher price points. Then you have complexity of product. I think when people talk about when cell ag or cell-based meat will hit the market, if you hear something like the mid-2020s, it does not mean that every single meat product will have a direct analog. Something like a steak is much more complicated than unstructured meats like ground beef and other products like that. And then you have consumer acceptance, which just sort of goes hand in hand with all of this and how the consumers will I use this sort of as a joke, but the perception of people when it comes to products that are made, quote unquote, in a lab. But I hope people see the prospective benefits, and that's why I think this goes hand in hand with other future technologies. Religion is also very important. Of the top 3 most followed religions in the world, at least one of them not to the same extent, but 2 of them have restrictions on animal products, whether it's porcine in Islamic faith or bovine meat in Hinduism. And so how will that affect cell-based bovine meat or porcine? So in summary, we went over what is cellular agriculture, what are some of its benefits, how it's possible, the process. Scientists would kill me for how simplified I made that process. What are the commercialization hurdles, and what will be important for us to get to sort of global commercialization, and the status quo meat production in the world is cell-based meat over slaughtering animals, and where it's happening in the world. And that's, again, on our site, cellag.info, you essentially see this exact talk, an interactive version if you want to go to the company's websites, see different people that are involved in the space, et cetera. So these are our social media links for Cass and myself. So thanks again.